Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of Just Here to Vibe. In case you're new here, I'm your host, Miranda, and in this podcast, we just sort of move through life one messy day at a time, talking about the human existence. So I've been thinking a lot recently about free time. And that is because if you've been following along, I currently have quite a bit of it. And so I was realizing that when it comes to how we spend our time outside of obligations and work, it really comes down to two types of activities, and those being activities where we create and the other being activities where we consume. And I was thinking about it a little bit more, and I feel like American culture has, interestingly enough, been very much built as a society based on consumption and not creating, at least at like an individual level. But it really sort of got me thinking about why is that? How does that sort of cultural viewpoint affect us and affect the views we have of ourselves, of other people around us? And really, when it comes to creating a life that is meaningful and fulfilling to us, is it based in consumption or creating? And how can we move towards creating a life and spending our free time in a way that's going to feel more valuable to us? So I guess getting into it, I really wanted to start with like a very, deep subject of getting into society today and sort of how our current cultural viewpoint stands at a macro level. So I will say for myself, I do believe inherently that human nature is really intrinsically based on creating, even if you go all the way back to like the hunter-gatherer, like pre-society days of our human nature was based on our ability to create shelter, to make art, to tell stories, even at a very early point. One of my favorite movies of all time is the 1989 film Dead Poets Society, in which one of the main characters, Professor Keating, played by the magnificent Robin Williams, has this whole speech about how even though jobs like engineers and doctors and lawyers are perfectly respectable professions and like very important for the fabric of society, really the human experience is based in passion and in art and poetry and all of these different forms of creating and being. And really, I think so much of what makes us human is how we create, whether it be through art, through different experiences in our lives, through choosing to be innovators. These are the types of things that really light us up inside and also add like very unique dimensions to an individual's life. Everyone, whether I think they recognize it or not, has sort of a chosen form of creating, and these forms of creating are often going to be the activities that bring us the most joy in our lives. So I think then the question really becomes, okay, but if that's sort of the idea, how did we as a society move more towards the viewpoint of valuing consumption or the act of consuming? So with this, I'm talking about a couple of different things, and yes, to an extent, speaking about consuming material things in excess, so whether that be food, the hoarding of wealth, this idea of just being very materialistic, but also in a lot of ways, I'm talking about what I feel like is being referred to nowadays as the attention economy. So this idea that we spend so much of our free time consuming media, whether that be social media, TV, movies, news to an extent even. And I think the inherent conflict is that in a capitalistic society, consumption is valued more than creating, because for the people who do create, consumption is where you make money. There is money in creating to an extent, but if you think about it, you can only make money off of your creations if somebody else is consuming it. So really at a like very base level, the entire system is built on the idea of consumption and of other people consuming what other people make. And without it, or the inherent fabric of society just kind of collapses in on itself. And like I said, there are creators to an extent. This could be anybody from an artist to a chef to like a TikTok influencer. But again, the money is in getting people to consume and not from the creators themselves. And I think social media in particular is a very unique example of this. So one of the first things they teach you about social media, right, is when it comes to how these companies make money, you are the product, like you being the user. The money is being made by you consuming time in these apps, consuming the different media, which then allows companies to sell ads to put in front of you to make money for both the company putting forth the ads, and then also for the media company by selling that ad space. And even though some people are able to capitalize on this system by becoming creators themselves, again, that only works for them if there are other people like you and me consuming on the app. So because in a capitalistic society, almost all money there is to be made is made by consumption and by the act of consumption, society is going to find ways to discourage creation, because if you're creating things for yourself, that gives you less time to consume other things, which means other people can't make money off of you. And I recognize that that sounds really bleak, and in a lot of ways it is, but it's also just sort of the truth of the world we live in today. So now I want to get into a bit about sort of the psychology behind creation and how we think through this idea of creating. I think one of the most unique things about creation, in my opinion, as someone who's just sort of starting to work through what that means to be a creator myself, is that even though it's often the things that like light us up in life, bring us a lot of joy, like some things we find a lot of value in, they can often be very energy consuming because there's so much mental work of investing and fully focusing on this activity. So let's use like cooking as an example. When you are cooking, you have to be fully focused on that activity and fully mentally invested in what you're doing, as compared to like if you're watching TV. I feel like everyone these days is watching TV, quote unquote, but then also like scrolling through their phone, doing dishes, like doing some form of chore. It's a much more passive activity as opposed to these more active forms of existence like cooking or painting, or even just like having a good conversation with a friend, all of which are very active, which is good because it means it takes up, your full attention span, but also means that they can often be very energy consuming because of how much attention you give to them. And so we need so much energy to create. And even though in a lot of ways this energy comes back to us because we get energized doing the things we love and care about, when you need energy to start doing the things you care about, I feel like that's where we get into a bind, because so much of society has been built around things that are meant to take that energy away from us. So even like at a very, very base level, right? You're working 40 hours a week. A lot of people in today's economy need to work multiple jobs just to get by. The lack of access we have at a societal level to good healthcare, proper nutrition, these are all things that take up a lot of energy and time from us. And then when you stack them all on top of each other in terms of just like, trying to maintain some base level of health or trying to have some semblance of a social life while also trying to keep your household intact, often leaves us with little energy at the end of the day to really do anything else. Let's take, for example, you work just basic 9 to 5, but your 9 to 5 is hard because not everyone gets to do something that really is fun and fulfilling for them. So you oftentimes just feel drained from that experience itself. And then you come home and you're exhausted. It's 6 p.m. Yeah, you have a few hours before bed, but there's a whole lot of other things you have to do and you're just worn out to begin with. And so what happens when you don't have any energy? You don't create, you go into consumption, because consumption is a passive activity. It's a lot easier to do. Consuming is easier because it takes zero mental energy. Like, it's so easy just to sit down in front of the TV. You don't even really have to pay attention to it, but it feels like you're passing the time. It feels at least sort of relaxing. And so that's what we end up giving our time to, because we feel like we don't have the energy to do anything else. And so then we become trapped in these really interesting cycles of we get into habits that wear ourselves out. And then we spend all of our free time just consuming different forms of like media or goods, which is draining in its own way. And then we just repeat the cycle over and over again. And even when you get to the weekend, you're so worn out from your week that you still end up not really doing anything because you feel like you need the whole weekend just to rest and reset for what's coming next. And this isn't me saying that there's never a time or a place for passive relaxation. There definitely is. But I feel like because of how ingrained it's become into our lives and how unconsciously we consume these types of activities, it often ends up trapping us in these lives where we never really do the things we actually want to do, and we end up living these lives that we just never wanted to live to begin with. And then I think the other sort of interesting part is, even if you're able to get through all that, right? If you're someone who does have a lot of free time, just like boundless energy to be able to create whatever it is you want, I think society also holds us back in a way from creating by putting these expectations around what we're creating. And I think a lot of that, again, just ties back to this idea we have around capitalism, and we often end up treating everything we do as a means to an end instead of just doing things for the joy of doing things. And I think for a lot of people like me, this started at a really, really early stage in childhood, like way before you would have been able to grasp the reality of like what that meant and the effects it would have for you later on. Because when you think about the stages we move through as we're moving through our young life into a more adult life, so much of what we're told to do and how we're told to spend the copious amounts of free time we have as a kid, so much of that is built around achieving and not experiencing. And by that, I mean, think of any sort of club or activity that you did as a kid. You know, if you were in sports, the point of the sport was oftentimes to win and to be competitive and to be the best. If you were in clubs, a lot of people were in clubs to either like prep them for high school or when you were in high school, so you would have the ability to put them on a college application. And then when you're in college, so much of what you do, whether it be clubs, sports, activities, whatever, is to put it on your resume so that when you graduate college, you can get a good job. And so through the course of our lives, we never really allowed ourselves to do things out of the joy of doing it. We did it all out of the expectation of achievement and progress. And so often we either don't develop hobbies at all because they end up feeling pointless because we don't think they serve some like greater purpose in our lives, or we don't do them because we think we're not good at them, so why bother? It's this whole mentality of, well, if I can't be the best at that thing, I'm not going to do it at all, even if I enjoy it, because why would I want to do something I'm not good at? Or we end up doing it with the expectation that it has to have some sort of reward just beyond the enjoyment of doing it itself. This is also to an extent where side hustles come into play, and that's sort of what I was referring to in this last point of it feels like today, if you have something you enjoy that you're also at least decently good at, it feels like there's almost this expectation that you're going to try to make money off of it. Like, it's not even a question. Even with the podcast, I had people asking me, oh, were you going to try to like make that your job? Or are you going to try to, put ads on it? And like, maybe one day, but I feel like it's this really toxic idea we have that anything that we enjoy doing or anything we feel like we're even slightly good at, to put the expectation on it of, well, that should be your livelihood and that should be how you make money. And so, at least for me in my life, I feel like it's really weird to get to a point in your late 20s and say this out loud, but I don't think I have any hobbies because I never learned how to have a hobby. I was one of those kids in school who was put in the, like gifted programs, and that's not supposed to be some sort of like humble brag. It was just there was some sort of potential seen in me from very early on, and so it felt like I was put on that sort of fast track of achievement. Everything you do, you need to be the best at because you're supposed to be this gifted kid and you're supposed to have all of these like abilities and talents. And so I basically spent my entire life learning that I either needed to be the best at everything, or if I was doing things that I wasn't inherently the best at, it needed to serve some sort of like greater purpose in my life to get me the leg up to the next stage of my existence. And so I never learned how to have fun and do things just because I thought they were fun. Everything had to have a point, and fun wasn't allowed to be the point. It had to serve some sort of greater purpose, and you don't do things for fun, you do things for a purpose. And so we end up building these lives where everyone has to serve this like capitalistic idea of having a purpose, and it really negates the human experience of just being able to enjoy things. And in a way, it's really, really sad. Like, why do we feel the need to be good at certain things or have the ability to make something out of ourselves via these artistic pursuits? If we never do anything just for the pure sake of doing it, how are we supposed to define what a good life is? Do we no longer look at life through the lens of, well, I did things I enjoyed? Or are we supposed to look at it through the lens of, well, it was only worth doing if I was successful at it, or, how successful I was at this thing now supposed to trump the fact that I enjoyed it at all? I feel like that's what ends up putting a lot of us on this path of defining our worth by our achievements, because from such a young age, that's kind of how we were told to define our self-worth, was by our ability to be good at things, and be good at things just for the sake of being good at things, regardless of how much or how little we liked doing those things. So going back to my childhood and how I grew up thinking about these things. In my life over the years, there were so many activities that I put down, even though I liked doing them, because like anybody else, there were just things that I wasn't good at. And it didn't matter that I liked the thing. What mattered more was that I wasn't good enough at the time to continue to pursue it. And that I was told that I should be, clearing the path for things I was good at, even if they were things that I didn't necessarily like. For example, I like painting, at least I think I do. And I often don't paint because I feel like embarrassed for some reason that I'm not better at it, because I have this weird idea that I'm 27 and, if I'm going to do this thing, I should be good at it. And it doesn't matter that I just like painting, even if I'm just painting weird abstract shapes, because it needs to be good. Good enough for who? I have no idea. But it's this idea that we keep putting these things down that we like because we built these ideas in our head around what they're supposed to represent and what these things say about us. And even though, I was never trying to be a professional painter, I'm still judging my enjoyment of the activity by my perception of being able to achieve success in it, and not just how the activity actually made me feel while I was doing it. And so this ends up resulting in situations where we either put things down that could bring a lot of fulfillment into our lives, or we just never pick them up in the first place because of these ideas we have around them. When we don't allow ourselves space for creation and doing things for the sake of enjoying doing them and doing these sorts of active activities, we ultimately end up falling back on consumption, because consuming is easier than creating. In a lot of ways, it feels lower risk, it feels safer than creating, and because it's what society kind of wants us to do. But in order for us to build a life that is fulfilling and is filled with joy, we have to be able to find meaning in the art of doing instead of the act of achieving, even though so much of life is built off of achievement and not enjoyment. So how do we start to sort of make that transition for ourselves? First, and I recognize even before saying it, that this is so much easier said than done, and for people like me who grew up with very rigid ideas of what success looked like in life, this is something that takes years to undo. But we have to learn to disconnect this idea that everything we spend our time on has to play into some capitalistic idea of success. So often, I feel like, again, especially in American and Western culture, success is based off of achievement and how many things you have, or how much money you make, or how high rolling your group of friends are and what social circles you fit in with. But when you talk to people, like older people who are at the end of their life, who have had an entire lifetime of experiencing and reflecting and being able to look back, almost unilaterally what they tell us is that, or their idea of success ends up shifting into the joy of doing things that mattered to them. So that could be following that hobby they always wanted to. It could be just spending more time with their friends and family. But success is found for these people in what the feeling of certain activities brings, not in their inherent ability to further your own status or wealth through the activity. This idea we have that you have to be good at everything for it to be worthy of your time is extremely misguided and often ends up pointing us in the wrong direction in life. If you've ever heard that phrase, like, it doesn't matter how fast you climb the ladder if the ladder's leaning against the wrong wall, like, that's exactly it. It's so easy for us to be focused on the pursuit of good that we never focus on the pursuit of fun. And so we end up becoming really good at things that we might not have even cared about. And so we spend so much of our lives chasing this idea of success that most of us didn't really want to begin with. It was just kind of instilled in us. And for a lot of high achievers like myself, this means decoupling the idea of success from your identity. I think especially if you were someone who was like particularly talented as a child in any regard, whether it be academically, athletically, whether you were really good at music, you are not your success. Success is not what makes you the person that you are. But that's something that takes so long to unlearn, because really the first 18 to 22 years of our life is built on the idea that's completely opposite of that. And so we have to learn to sort of reclaim our own identities. And for a lot of people who are gifted that then go through this process, it sort of does cause an identity crisis, because we've spent so much of our lives defining our identities to a certain extent by our achievements. And so if you rip that away, you sort of have to redefine who you even think you are to yourself. And so the next thing we have to do is become more aware of how consuming makes us feel. Like I said, I don't think consumption is bad all of the time. There are plenty of times and places and experiences where you are just sort of passively consuming different things in life that are perfectly fulfilling, and that's okay. What I'm talking about, though, is paying attention to how consuming different things in different quantities affects you. Think about the difference between watching an episode of a show you like and sitting down to binge 5 hours, or the difference between buying something that you've actually wanted and have been saving up for and thinking about for a long time, and the difference of just impulse buying something that you just saw at the store and thought you wanted. Different types of consumption are going to affect you differently and will either create more energy for you or are going to drain you. And what's important is that we learn to be more mindful when we're consuming about how we feel while we're consuming these different things. What is actually adding value to your life, and what do you sort of use as a numbing effect to just escape the world around you? And then once we've identified those things in life, we can look to places where we can bring more energy into our lives. So a lot of the negative habits we build around consumption comes from a lack of energy. So going back to that thing of you come home at the end of a long work day and now I'm too tired to do anything else, so I'm just going to plop in front of the TV for 4 hours. So how do we have the energy to do the things we actually want to do in life when it feels like so much of the world has been built around things that sort of drain our energy from the beginning of our day onward? I mean, the first one, obvious. You gotta be sleeping. You gotta be eating right. You have to be working out. If you're not, nothing else you do at this point is going to matter. And then going back to the point I just made, once we have the ability and the cognizance to recognize what in our life is draining us, we can start to build habits around these themes in our life to block that section of the day off from everything else. So I think something that's become really draining for a lot of people in the past couple of years in particular is working from home. I think the separation or the lack of separation between having a work life and then having a non-work life has become so blurred. And so if you are in a job that's draining, how can you create sort of mental blockers around your workday to be able to truly separate your work time from your non-work time? Because where we often end up tripping ourselves up is because these lines are so blurry, so much bleeds from one part of your life into another. And to an extent, I think that's unavoidable, but there's definitely things we can do to help sort of chunk our days off to allow ourselves to have the mental breathing room to then be able to do something else. And then I think the final thing we can do here is just find tiny ways to start creating. Again, I think when we get into this idea of starting a creative endeavor, regardless of what it is, whether you want to pick up an instrument or start a podcast or just start hanging out with your friends more and having good conversations, I feel like oftentimes we feel like we have to make these big 180 life shifts and make all of these giant changes and be able to devote hours and hours to this thing. And that's not it. It's really about purposefully creating time to do the things that light you up. Because when you can find time for these things, they're ultimately going to create more energy for you and be able to put you into these flow states where you are just going to be able to vibe through life, essentially. And so the goal is really just to make it worthwhile for yourself. Again, we need to move away from this idea of existence is just consumption and that we don't have the energy to do things for ourselves that bring us joy. Really what we're here to do is just experience what we enjoy simply for the sake of experiencing it without all of these different expectations and addendums around it. Creating comes in so many different forms, but at the end of the day, that is the building block of creating a life that's worth living for yourself. But I recognize that getting into that space requires so much deprogramming from what we've been told to do our entire lives. And so at the beginning, when you're sort of moving through this process and really learning to reconnect with yourself in this way, it's gonna feel almost like an act of defiance and an act of resistance to everything you've been taught to do. But I feel like most importantly for you, it's an act of progress. It's an act of making space in your life for the things that matter, so you don't be one of those people individual at 80 who has all of these regrets because you lost so much of your time to things you never cared about to begin with. And again, you can consume, but you have to consume consciously, just like you have to create consciously. The idea is just to be aware of the value things have or don't have in your life, and then have the strength to rearrange your life accordingly. I guess sort of closing out, if you're someone like me who is older than they feel like they should be with no idea of what their hobbies are, I think the easiest way to start is go back to what you loved as a kid. And if you were someone who from a very young age like did things because they were the right thing to do and not necessarily the fun thing to do, like you might have to go back far. So when you were 5, what did you enjoy as a kid? When you had your playtime in kindergarten, what did you do? Were you building with blocks? Were you coloring in coloring books? And these things that we did at a very young age before we sort of learned to have the expectation of achievement on us is often a really good starting place for what we should be going back to as an adult. And with that, we have concluded this week's episode of Just Here to Vibe. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me today. Let me know what your hobbies are. Like I said, I'm still in the very early stages in so many ways of figuring out what it is that I actually enjoy in life. So I'm sort of in my try anything and everything stage, and I'm very much open to suggestion. Sometimes, analysis paralysis. I have too many choices and too many things that I think I might want to do, but what's a few more at this point? So with that, I'll see you in the next one. Again, I'm your host, Miranda, and I'll talk to you then.